95% of all telephone and data is transferred over submarine cables.
Not satellite.
Not satellite.
Over land, the voices travel from tower to tower on a radio beam, being amplified and re-amplified at each relay point along the way. However, since relay towers must always be in sight of each other, inevitably the limit to radio relay transmission is the ocean. Radio telephone communication of another type has been in service across the Atlantic for many years. Radio waves are beamed to the sky and reflected down to Earth on the other side of the ocean. However, nearly all the wavelengths available for telephone communication have already been put to use to handle the ever-growing volume of international calls.
It's what allows us to rely on instant everything: phone calls, banking, web surfing, email, streaming video, and other communication.
Heavy case?
And it all began 150 years ago.
We have here samples of the early cables from the 1850s.
They're coiling it the same way they did in the 1800s.
Some of the items have not been on display in more than a century.
With this cable now, it was what, minutes?
Yeah, that's right.
It sounds like this was the original information age.
That's right.
If you've ever phoned or emailed someone on another continent or browsed a foreign website, you can dial up some gratitude for something that happened a century and a half ago.
It's been 150 years since the first transatlantic cable began ushering in global communications. And now tech giants are taking that undersea revolution a big step further. Here's Mark Albert.
When you pick up the phone to reach out and touch someone across the oceans, it's only possible because of
satellite.
Not satellite.
Not satellite.
Not satellite.
like the Global Sentinel.
This is cable tank number 1.
And what am I standing on right now? Not satellite.
Not satellite. You're standing on fiber optic cable that's going to be laid from here towards Brazil.
Not satellite.
Not satellite.
This is how worldwide communication begins.
Not satellite.
Not satellite.
Jeff Sanders is a captain at TE Connectivity Subcom, which calls itself the world's largest provider of under-ocean fiber optic cable.
Not satellite.
Not satellite. They're coiling it the same way they did in the 1800s.
He gave us a rare view of more than 900 miles of cable spooled tightly by hand in one of 3 side-by-side tanks aboard the ship anchored in the port of Newington in New Hampshire.
Not satellite.
Not satellite.
So the cable we're walking on right now will be under the ocean carrying my phone calls?
Yes, it will. It's a good chance any call you make to South America in the future could be on this exact cable for the next 20, 25 years. Cable comes right off into the ocean from here.
Robots take over from there, diving to a depth too deep for humans. The machines use water jets to create a trench, allowing the cable to sink into the seabed and become buried.
95% of all telephone and data is transferred over submarine cables.
Not satellite.
Not satellite.
Phone calls, banking, web surfing, email, streaming video, and other communication all began 150 years ago.
We have here samples of the early cables from the 1850s.
This is what the first permanent cable looked like under the Atlantic.
Absolutely.
Barney Finn at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History helped string together an exhibit commemorating the 150th anniversary of the first permanent transatlantic cable, and the man who assembled the financial, political, and technical prowess to make it happen, entrepreneur Cyrus Field. Some of the items have not been on display in more than a century.
And this indeed is the cable going across the Atlantic.
Laid in rough seas, the first few copper cables broke or burnt out. When it finally worked after a decade of failure, Field wrote to his wife on July 27, 1866, "All well, thank God." Great Britain's Queen Victoria congratulated U.S. President Andrew Johnson in this message.
If I was living in 1866 and I wanted to send a message to a relative in Ireland or in England,
Right.
It would take 10 days by ship to get there, however long to write the message, and 10 days to get back. With this cable now, it was what, minutes?
Yeah, that's right.
It sounds like this was the original information age.
That's right.
For the next 90 years, the cable handled messages by Morse code before telephone cables arrived. Today, a maze of fiber optic cables crisscross the oceans and the U.S. a blazing fast 160 terabyte per second cable from Virginia to Spain.
We can transmit the entire contents of the Library of Congress across the Atlantic Ocean in 2 seconds.
On November 27, 1953, that the transatlantic telephone cable project officially began.
It's connecting the world and connecting families, and it's a mission that we enjoy doing.
For CBS This Morning Saturday, Mark Albert, Newington, New Hampshire.
It's amazing. And Mark sent us these thin little threads.
Yeah, it's
Have
housed
all
in
the
this. When they
information.
put it under, it's housed in a thicker thing, but the actual cable itself, I mean, you can barely see it. And this is what the Library of Congress is traveling in 2 seconds.
That's astounding.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Wow.
Then Postmaster General signed for the British Post Office. While in Montreal, Canada's cooperation was assured by the director of the agency in charge of overseas communications. It was a remarkable contract, providing for the sharing of research, personnel, equipment, and cost. Communication by voice has always involved a kind of broadcast. Long-distance service became a reality. The problems of keeping the voices loud and clear multiplied. In San Francisco in 1906, a man could shout into a telephone, "Earthquake!" And by the time his voice was transmitted 400 miles to Los Angeles, it sounded like a distant whisper. Through the years, while they were working to improve the service in every way, telephone people gave special attention to this problem of keeping conversations strong and clear over ever greater distances. Over land, the voices travel from tower to tower on a radio beam, being amplified and re-amplified at each relay point along the way. However, since relay towers must always be in sight of each other, inevitably the limit to radio relay transmission is the ocean. Radio telephone communication of another type has been in service across the Atlantic for many years. Radio waves are beamed to the sky and reflected down to Earth on the other side of the ocean. However, nearly all the wavelengths available for telephone communication have already been put to use to handle the ever-growing volume of international calls. And unfortunately, at times, atmospheric conditions interfere with the satisfactory operation of the radio telephone system. The answer to improved transatlantic telephone communication was a cable, a telephone cable from shore to shore. Telegraph cables across the ocean had been operating for nearly a century. But the telegraphic transmission of Morse code was relatively simple compared with the far more complex electronic problem of transmitting many telephone conversations at the same time. Those repeaters had to be especially designed to fit within the cable itself. Then they could be paid out through the machinery of the cable-laying ship to slide down into ocean depths, there to operate untouched by man for 20 years and more. The core of a simple coil. Yet that coil must operate perfectly for 20 years and more, perhaps 2.5 miles beneath the sea. Wound with the ultimate of care, it had to pass microscopic inspection at every test. The finished coil was sent to take its place as one of the many intricate parts of a single section of the repeater assembly. 17 different units joined together made up the repeater assembly. A copper tube outside the steel rings would prevent a single drop of seawater from getting into the repeater and possibly silencing the cable. With final coverings of hot tar and jute, the process was complete. The finished cable moved off the assembly line to storage tanks for its final test. Late spring of 1955 found Her Majesty's ship Monarch loading cable at the Simplex plant. The first actual cable lay of the project was about to begin. Selection of the best possible transatlantic route was one of the many problems requiring consultation between representatives of Great Britain and Canada and executives of AT&T's Long Lines Department. Actually, apart from the deep-sea cable-laying operations, other work was moving forward in Canada, in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and in Newfoundland. Here the plan called for trenching in many miles of the cable overland across some of the most rugged terrain of the island province. Whatever the terrain, whatever the weather, the cable was put down. Towers and stations for the radio relay section. The giant cornucopia-like horns, which were to serve as receivers and transmitters of the radio beam, were raised and put in place. The radio relay towers and shore stations were ready to receive the first words the cable was to carry. Installations were complete. Auxiliary power supplies ready for their need. In the overseas telephone exchange in New York, all was prepared for the added volume of calls the new cable would make possible. The personnel were trained, new positions standing by. In the Clarenville shore station, technicians stood ready and waiting, eager for that first two-way contact through the cables with the Oban station 2,000 miles away. The test was quickly passed, with voices racing swift and clear across the conquered deep. There were many who had brought this thing to pass. Through the efforts of thousands of Americans, British and Canadians working at 100 different tasks, a significant contribution to communications history has been achieved. The world is smaller today for their efforts, the kind of international cooperation which has brought to reality the voice beneath the sea.
95% of all telephone and data is transferred over submarine cables.
Not satellite.
Not satellite. Not satellite. Not satellite. Not satellite. Not satellite.